In a previous program on the Greco-Persian Wars, I made a controversial claim. The best thing, I said, that ever happened to ancient Athens was its complete and utter destruction by the Persian Empire in 480 BC. Sounds crazy, right? But think about it. The Athenians actually won that war with their entire population intact, so they had the chance to rebuild everything from scratch, this time with tons of money and talent flowing in from the rest of Greece, combined with the enthusiasm of victory. It's like they were given a blank slate and a blank check to build a new civilization over the ruins of the old. Now, this perfect storm created an explosion of cultural productivity, the likes of which few civilizations have been able to rival. That was the gist of my argument. Well, today, we're going to explore a work of literature which I think, more than any other from classical Athens, encapsulates that unprecedented unleashing of creative human genius. It's a work rarely taught in schools nowadays. Perhaps you haven't even heard of it, partly because it is difficult to read without a knowledgeable guide and quite a bit of background information. But it's extremely relevant to our present moment because it was born from the same crucible which forged the world's first powerful democracy. And it reflects the hopes, dreams, and warnings of a society that rode that roller coaster of democracy long before we tried to reboot it. The work I'm talking about is Aeschylus's ORESTEIA. The ORESTEIA is a trilogy of 3 tragedies that were performed back-to-back in the main theater of ancient Athens on the slopes of the Acropolis on one sunny afternoon in 458 BC. It became an instant blockbuster for the Athenians. It was cherished by later generations of Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, and Europeans of the Renaissance. And today, with the help of a fellow scholar and friend of mine, we're going to try to relive its magic and uncover its genius. Buckle up. Does it ever happen to you that you watch an old movie and suddenly feel transported to an earlier era? I mean, even if the film does not accurately depict the world as it was when it was made, and they seldom do, everything about the way the film was made, the story it tells, the way people speak, it all pulls you back to a different world, a bygone way of living and thinking. Now, movies only go back about 100 years, but ancient Athenian drama, if reproduced well on stage or taught by a good teacher, offers almost that kind of cinematic experience that pulls you back into a lost world. It's like you're sitting in the ancient theater of Athens and watching the shows that the Athenians watched. Now, the key thing that I mentioned is that you need a good guide, especially for the ORESTEIA, which is an extremely difficult text to read. And so, for this episode, I invited someone with an uncanny ability to bring ancient stories to life. Many of you already know him, but in case you don't, Doug Metzger is a scholar, author, and podcaster. He has a PhD in literature, and of course, he is the host of literatureandhistory.com. Doug, welcome back to AGD.
Thanks, Jack. It's always a joy to be here, and I know this is a work of literature that both of us love very much. We talk about it for fun sometimes on the phone when we're just passing the time.
And that's how this episode came to be. Just to fill in our listeners, I roped you into this a few days ago. We were talking on the phone, and you mentioned that you had just reread the ORESTEIA for fun, as Doug does. And I was like, dude, come on the show. Let's do it now that it's fresh in your mind. I've been wanting to do an episode on this work for years, so I seized the opportunity. I carped that DM, and here you are. So,
Sure.
Oh, I should also say that I deliberately did not reread this before today's conversation because I want you to take me along for the ride along with our audience. Of course, I remember some things. I'm going to bring in some tidbits I remember from grad school, but is there anything we need to know as background information before we dive in?
Let's get a panoramic sense of the ORESTEIA, of these 3 plays, real quick. You gave a great introduction. A theatrical trilogy, first premiered in 458 BCE at the Theater of Dionysus. This is the only extant surviving theatrical tragedy that exists as a set of 3 plays. Ancient Athenian tragedians staged trilogies of tragedies. That was the theatrical unit that ancient Athenians loved. And this is the only one we have that survived in its entirety so that we can see the full plot arc from play number 1 all the way to play number 3. In total, it's about 3,700 lines. The first play is substantially longer than the second 2 plays. Before you jump into this story, what you really need to know is probably first that it's about a family. It's about a very famous ancient Greek mythological family. The patriarch goes way back 4 generations into Greek mythology, too much for us to cover. But the main person in this family is King Agamemnon of the Greeks, the main leader in the Homeric Trojan War and a major character in the Iliad and the Odyssey. So this is a story about Agamemnon's family, his wife and his children, and one of his cousins. And the second thing to know about the Oresteia, beyond that it's a family, is that it's a story about revenge. It's a story about how revenge can kind of lead to long cycles of blood for blood killing, and maybe that there's a way out of that eventually. And it's a story about going from old ways to new ways, old gods to new gods. And I would humorously argue that this trilogy uses the word blood so many times that you could almost play a drinking game out of it. Each time Aeschylus uses the word blood or flesh, this is a blood and thunder violent trilogy. It is heavy metal album cover material, and it is really a lot of fun, as difficult as it can be too. So that's my opening pitch on the Oresteia.
Now I'm regretting not having a Bloody Mary with me right now to take a sip.
I seriously thought about it because, and anybody who's watching or listening, feel free. Just listen for the word blood.
So to quote the words of Vin Diesel in The Fast and the Furious, I think he actually says this in like every single Fast and Furious movie, it's all about family.
Okay.
But unlike Hollywood, there are certain things we should not expect from a Greek tragedy, right? Like we should not expect good versus evil. We should not expect that there's an evil villain and a good hero and the good hero wins. That's not how this works.
Right. We expect moral complexity, and just as importantly, what we expect is often Homeric characters. Over here, I have the Iliad and the Odyssey, and as probably a lot of people listening or watching know, this is kind of the headwaters of ancient Greek literature. This is where it all begins. And these were produced sometime very roughly around 700 BCE. And then centuries later, 200, 300 years later, when tragedians like Aeschylus came along in the 400s, they told stories about these very old Homeric characters, and we can think of them as spin-off tales and reboots and franchise reboots, and they get, interestingly, progressively more sensational and bloody and violent, such that by the time we get to the Oresteia, there's a lot of blood and thunder, like I said earlier.
So, as you just mentioned, these playwrights of the 5th century in Athens, the ones that are writing the serious plays, the tragedies, they are using almost exclusively characters from the long-lost mythical past. Are these plays really about the Bronze Age, or are they about Athens?
It's a great question. Yeah, are these just kind of solemn returns to the ancient past to celebrate old stories? And indeed, they're not. They are certainly stories that revere Homer. Every ancient Greek author, seemingly, or pretty close, revered Homer. But these are also stories that are very much about the contemporary world of Athens, too. And I think probably the Athenians who won as tragedians, who won the big city Dionysia festival, the big springtime theater festival of ancient Athens, they were the ones who most poignantly and aptly connected the legendary mythological past with what was going on in the streets and farm fields of Athens in the 400s BCE. And I think, as we'll see as we get into this play, Aeschylus absolutely does that.
Great. So I want to let you dive in. I want to get through the story because we're going to cover all 3 plays. Okay, it's a very ambitious thing to try to do in one YouTube video / podcast episode. I think inevitably we're going to take pauses and analyze certain things that come up.
Just so the audience knows too, I have warmly invited Jack to jump in at any point. This is a work of literature that we both love, so if the interviewer speaks a little bit more than is customary in an interview situation, he's been invited to do so. So, yeah.
All right, so launch us into it.
Okay, well, everybody, let's talk about the Greek king Agamemnon and who he was, because he is kind of the big machine that drives the beginning of the Oresteia. Agamemnon is a character in Homer's Iliad, and Agamemnon in Book 1 of the Iliad is a bit of an authoritarian. He takes the wife or the girlfriend or sex slave of Achilles, her name is Briseis, and subsequently Achilles becomes so angry that he sits out the action for the next 19 books of the entire Iliad. And then later on in the Iliad, in Book 11, he has what classicists call an Oresteia. He has kind of an eye of the tiger battle sequence where he jumps into the action, single-handedly carries the day. So in summation, in the first Homeric epic, in Homer's Iliad, Agamemnon is a powerful king who holds his own, but not really the kind of guy that you'd want to have a cup of coffee with because he's a bit of a megalomaniac. 10 years go by between the events of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and by the time we get to the Odyssey, Agamemnon has died. The Odyssey is 9-10 years after the Iliad, and Agamemnon has died, but for a dead guy, he has a lot of on-stage time in Homer's Odyssey. He appears in the underworld sequence of the Odyssey, and then he appears a final time at the end of Homer's Odyssey. And this is where we get close to the Oresteia, our work for today. Because what Agamemnon tells Odysseus twice is that Odysseus's wife Penelope remained loyal to Odysseus the whole time he was away at the Trojan War, but Agamemnon's wife Clytemnestra, contrastingly, was not loyal to Agamemnon. And so when Agamemnon came home from the Trojan War, we learn way back in this book, his wife Clytemnestra murdered him. So that is the main event of the first play, and I don't mean to spoil the plot, but ancient Greeks who originally went to see the Oresteia would have known how this story ended. So that takes us to Agamemnon, which we can jump into now, Jack.
Yeah, that's super helpful background information. So Homer did all that. Homer established that
Right.
storyline that every single Greek going to these plays knew about. Now we're in Athens, hundreds of years later. Who is this guy Aeschylus who is producing this fan fiction?
Okay, so how about a couple minutes on Aeschylus, just so we know who our author is for today. So Aeschylus lived from about around 525 to 456 BCE or so. The Oresteia was written in the last few years of his life. This again was 458. Aeschylus was at ground zero for some of the most important events in classical Athenian history. He saw the rise of democracy at the end of the 500s under the reformer Cleisthenes. He fought at the Battle of Marathon in 490 with his brother. His brother was killed there. He fought at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE and saw to the Greek victory there too. So he was a quintessential kind of generation one of democratic Greeks. And he was remembered very much for his martial victories in addition to his theatrical career.
And it's interesting because I made the point in my intro that this play is a product of that enthusiasm, the post-war, the post-Persian invasion, enthusiasm, economic boom, everything. And I think it's interesting that Aeschylus's epitaph, the inscription on his tombstone, if you will, which he probably had a large say in what would go on there, only mentioned his participation in these battles.
That's right.
Like he thought that was more important. That was more important in his life that he fought these battles than that he wrote these plays. So I think that really underscores how his creative genius was catapulted by these cataclysmic events that he witnessed and participated in.
That's right. So now we've met Aeschylus. Let's jump into the Oresteia now. So Agamemnon is the first play, and it's about how Agamemnon came home from the Trojan War and what happened to him when he did. It's more than half again as long as the other two, so this one is important. We'll spend a little bit more time with it, I imagine. Agamemnon begins with a watchman standing on the walls of Argos, and he's been standing there so long, he says, that he has memorized all the stars in the sky, and he's been waiting to see watchfires or beacons that herald the homecoming of King Agamemnon. And he sees them, and then the watchman feels a sense of joy and simultaneous dread because he knows that things have changed in King Agamemnon's absence. So far, so good, Jack?
Yes, but so here I'm going to be annoying and
Good.
stop you a little bit. What is the very first line?
Let's read it.
Okay. Because something I've said on my show a lot, probably to my listeners' annoyance, is that I believe the first line of these classic works is always the most important in many ways. So yeah, what
Okay.
does he say?
Darkest hour just before dawn on the walls of Argos, the watchman says, O gods, grant me release from this long, weary watch.
And because there's always tricky things with translation, let me just offer another one.
Good.
This is the Summerstein translation. I beg the gods to give me release from this misery, which in this case, I think it's a little bit better because I think that this line is a one-line summary of the entire trilogy. The gods are going to give the Athenians, so again, this is not really about Agamemnon, it's really about Athens. The gods are going to give the Athenians, who are building a new civilization, a release from the horrors and the miseries of an earlier, more barbaric time. That's kind of
well said.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, that could be the Oresteia in an opening line. So, yeah, good call to pause there.
Yeah. Since you have a background in more modern literature as well, I'm sure you've read tons of Shakespeare and other great playwrights. Tell me what you think about this opening where, instead of opening with Agamemnon or with Clytemnestra or with the gods, as is common in epic poetry, we have this humble servant who's shivering on a rooftop. Like, what does that evoke to you?
There's a lot about Aeschylus that seems to be interested in contemporary history and to some extent the experiences of common people who are caught up in the vortex of history. Definitely. His first play, 472 BCE, The Persians, was unusual in the context of ancient Greek drama because it was about current events. And so I think in this case, we do see Aeschylus as a tragedian, oftentimes focusing on people battered by the cyclones of wars and history and things like that. And that's primarily why I would imagine he would start with this watchman, that stuff is about to go down, and don't forget that a lot of people other than the main figures in the opera are going to be involved.
That's quite a democratic sentiment. And again, he's the product of the times. He's writing
Sure.
at the peak of democratic reform and democratic fervor in Athens. So, all right.
Yeah.
I apologize for the digression.
No.
Let's continue. Yeah.
There will be a couple more slowdowns because one thing that I imagine we both wanted to talk about is that this watchman says that Agamemnon is coming home, and then the chorus begins a long song. As many people know, choruses in ancient Greek tragedies, the chorus might be a body of elders. In the second play in this trilogy, it's slave women. In the third, it's the Furies. But the chorus usually just kind of meditates and muses on things. If you need somebody to muse or ruminate, a chorus can absolutely nail that task. And they do a lot of that in the play Agamemnon. So the chorus begins musing darkly about Agamemnon's homecoming. It should be a joyous occasion. The king has won the war, but it's not that joyous for some reason. And we pretty quickly learn why. We learn specifically that before King Agamemnon left for the Trojan War, about 10 years before, he had slaughtered his daughter Iphigenia in order to get favorable winds to blow the Greeks eastward to Troy. This is a moment in the play that is so powerful that one day Jack and I were talking about it, and we both spontaneously started to tear up. And I can read some of that story about Iphigenia that the chorus recalls, or we can keep going, whatever you would like to do.
Yes, please read it. And as you're finding that page, just to mention that the word chorus in Greek means a dance. And while they do meditate and offer background thoughts, larger perspectives, sometimes more popular perspectives on the ongoing plot, they're also performers. They're dancing. This is strange for modern readers to see this chorus in these ancient plays, but this was a way to have community participation in these theatrical productions. Random citizens were recruited to be in these choruses. So this is a very lively thing that's happening. And the chorus here is giving the audience a kind of refresher on what happened prior to the action of the play, and an episode that's not really covered by Homer either. So it's an opportunity for Aeschylus to really shine. So take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Yeah, absolutely. And it's always important to remember this was music and dance. I will just read the lines though.
Yeah.
So, uh, so the chorus remembers this about how Agamemnon kills his daughter Iphigenia in order to get to the Trojan War, because a seer tells Agamemnon that the Greeks will only have favorable winds to sail east if he kills his daughter. And Agamemnon lies to Iphigenia and tells her that she's going to be married and to put on her very nicest clothes. And then something different happens. And that's what makes this passage I'm about to read so piercingly tragic. So here it is, Philip Vellacott translation, published by Penguin. Quote, "So Agamemnon, rather than retreat, endured to offer up his daughter's life to help a war fought for a faithless wife and pay the ransom for a storm-bound fleet. Heedless of her tears, her cries of 'Father,' and her maiden years, her judges valued more their glory and the war. A prayer was said, her father gave the word. Limp in her flowing dress, the priest's attendants held her high above the altar as men hold a baby goat. Her father spoke again to bid one bring a gag and press her sweet mouth tightly with a cord, lest Atreus's house be cursed by some ill-omened cry. Rough hands tear at her girdle, cast her saffron silks to earth. Her eyes search for her slaughterers, and each, seeing her beauty that surpassed a painter's vision, yet denies the pity her dumb looks beseech." So that's part of this opening choral ode, and we learn what happened to Agamemnon's daughter Iphigenia and just how tragic it was.
Yeah, that's powerful stuff, man. Getting goosebumps listening to you there.
It still hurts, yeah.
And just a few things to because it's hard to follow, especially if you're not looking at the text and looking at the Greek. So a few notable things here. One is the men that are standing around as she's being sacrificed. They're called judges there, right? And that, I think, calls to mind the function of the Athenian citizenry as jurors, as judges, as deciders of whether they go to war or not. So this play is saturated with hints about justice at a community level.
Absolutely.
And then, like Shakespeare, he plays with words. Her eyes are described as shooting pity-eliciting darts at the men, at the judges standing around her. It's heart-wrenching. It's brilliant, but
yeah. So we may love this scene more than any other people on earth, so maybe we should press on, but it is a piercingly powerful scene in which the chorus recollects some important context for the play. And so in the opening moments of Agamemnon, which we've now spent a good, I don't know how long on, but in the opening moments of Agamemnon, there is a simultaneous sense of joy and ominous dread at the same time. The king is coming home. The king is kind of a scoundrel. What's going to happen to him? And the rest of the play tells that story. So you want to press onward?
yes.
Okay. So Clytemnestra finally speaks. The chorus at one point asks Clytemnestra to speak. Clytemnestra is again the kind of imperious, proud, and eventually we find out vengeful wife of Agamemnon. Clytemnestra says, "Let the new day shine, as the proverb says, glorious from the womb of Mother Night." That's her opening line. I think it's a terrific opening line in literature. And she pretends to be overjoyed that her husband is coming home. She says nothing bad about the fact that Agamemnon has killed Iphigenia, although eventually we find out that that's one of the main motivators for her actions in the subsequent play. So several days take place, several days pass off camera, and when the play Agamemnon begins again, a herald has come from Troy. This herald that arrives from Troy kisses the soil of Argos. He's been gone for 10 years, and he tells the chorus what things have been like over there in Troy. And they haven't been good. The war at Troy went on for 10 years, and over the course of those 10 years, the Greeks were living like animals down alongside their ships. They were freezing in the winter and hot in the summer, and in a lot of ways just kind of descended into this low bestial life. This is what this herald emphasizes, who's come home. Clytemnestra tells the herald that she's been nothing but faithful to Agamemnon, and this builds what we call dramatic irony, where the audience knows something and the characters in the play do not. So the chorus gives this very ominous speech about Helen of Troy, saying that Helen of Troy is like a lion cub that was raised by people who took her in, only the lion cub eventually ate everyone and tore them to pieces. It's a fairly gory moment for Aeschylus. And then Agamemnon arrives.
Can you explain that a little bit?
I'd be happy to read it. It's an immense little monologue. Yeah.
I'm sure it is, but just explain the lion. Like, how does that simile work exactly?
So the description that the chorus offers, and Helen comes up a lot in the Oresteia. In fact, before I explain the lion thing, women really drive the events of the Trojan War in some ways, and they drive the events of the Oresteia to some extent. The goddesses Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite are the ones that build the power blocks to fight the Trojan War. Helen's is the face that launches 1,000 ships. Penelope is the person around whom all the suitors are gathered and to whom Odysseus is going home. Certainly not saying that there isn't a lot of tough warriors and macho men that we all love too, but there's actually a lot of women driving the action in these stories. So the chorus numerous times kind of reflect on the power and the menace of Helen, that she's like a hurricane that has just driven all these events into motion. And when they describe Helen as a lion midway through the play, their emphasis is that she seems like she's just a beautiful woman, not unlike a lion cub. It's just that when her true nature is revealed, her true nature is absolutely destructive at a massive level. And later in the play, the chorus begins to kind of blame Helen for the Trojan War, and Clytemnestra won't have any of it. It's wonderful. She comes to her sister's defense. Clytemnestra and Helen are sisters. We may have failed to mention that, but hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, so carry on.
Sure, you got it, man. So Clytemnestra, after her sister is maligned by the chorus, comes on stage, and she again says that she's so joyous to see her husband come home. Agamemnon arrives very fittingly in a chariot. In his chariot, he has the Trojan princess Cassandra in the back. She is his newest sex slave, and Clytemnestra, acting maybe for reasons of state and political theater, affects nothing more than complete joy. And she's unsurprised to see Cassandra. She says, "Cassandra, don't be afraid at being reduced to a slave. Even Hercules was a slave at one point." And Clytemnestra lays out a red tapestry or carpet so that Agamemnon can walk on this carpet into his palace and complete his victorious homecoming. And initially Agamemnon is reluctant, but after he bloviates and celebrates his homecoming a little bit, he concedes to walking on the carpet into his home. And then the chorus has a fairly long conversation with Cassandra. And what is Cassandra's curse, Jack?
That she can see the future before it happens, but that nobody will ever believe anything she says about it.
That's right. And it's a pretty tough curse. I mean, we've all been in the situation where we might, for once, actually know the right answer, but nobody believes us. And she has to feel like that all the time. It's awful. Do you remember why she got that curse?
I think there's various versions, most of which are preserved in later sources, but one is that she, as a young maiden, she was a priestess in a temple of Apollo, and she was a fine-looking young girl, and Apollo saw her once and got hot and bothered and made a move on her, and she rejected him. And so in his anger, I think he actually like spits in her mouth, and the divine saliva creates the power to speak oracular prophecy. But he curses her that no one will ever believe those divinely empowered utterances. Is that the version you know?
And this is what we learn in this part of the Oresteia.
We do.
Yeah, most of it, yeah. A couple details were left out. So that Cassandra tells the chorus about how she refused to be Apollo's wife, and Apollo subsequently cursed her with this ability, this curse that you just described. So, and we're almost toward the end of the play. The action has been building and spinning and mounting. After Cassandra tells her story about why she has this awful curse, Clytemnestra comes out and brings Cassandra into the palace. And then the chorus discusses what's going on. In the midst of their discussion, they hear screams from inside the palace at Argos. One of the things that we learn about ancient Greek plays is that usually the most calamitous action unfolds off stage. If there's going to be a murder, if there's going to be a suicide or something like that, it's not going to happen on the stage. And so then the palace doors momentously crash open, and we see the image of the play Agamemnon. I think the most iconic image, which is King Agamemnon has been wrapped in these red garments or carpets that he's walked over to go into his palace victoriously, only Clytemnestra has knifed him to death. And he is in a silver bathtub, and she is vaunting and victorious and unapologetic. And the chorus has a blistering 200-line exchange with Clytemnestra. One thing about the chorus of the play Agamemnon is that they're a little bit more of an active and aggressive chorus than we often see in ancient Greek tragedy. You were talking earlier, Jack, about how the choruses were sort of part of the civic assembly of Athens, and in this case, the chorus, the democratic voice, is fighting with these autocratic, ruthless murders in a certain way on stage. And at the end of this exchange between Clytemnestra and the chorus, Aegisthus, who is King Agamemnon's cousin, comes out. And Aegisthus reveals the final, and in some ways the darkest secret of all, of the first play. This secret is that Agamemnon's father killed Aegisthus's father's sons and served Aegisthus's father's sons to him in a stew. So, pretty awful crime. I don't know if it gets much worse than that. And after this secret comes out, Clytemnestra and Aegisthus essentially say, "We are in charge now." And Clytemnestra tells Aegisthus, "We don't need to listen to the chorus anymore. The chorus, these old men of Argos are just dogs, and we're in charge now." So that's how Agamemnon ends. It's a cliffhanger ending. The entire cycle of Agamemnon's family, including that bit about the cannibalism that I just described, was known in ancient Greek mythology. Agamemnon's great-grandfather Tantalus committed crimes, his grandfather Pelops committed crimes, his father Atreus committed crimes, and Agamemnon started the Trojan War, and so we know that it's not quite over yet and that stuff is going to continue to happen because we haven't yet met Orestes, for whom the Orestian trilogy is named, who we meet in the next play. So anything else about Agamemnon you wanted to cover, Jack?
I mean, I think you did a fantastic job. There's so much happening in my mind right now listening to you. It feels to me like this, again, as you said, this is the only trilogy that survives from antiquity. And it's amazing to me how it seems to have a similar structure to modern classical symphonies or concertos, which are almost always in three movements. The first movement is usually the largest. It's fast-paced. It's got a lot of boom, boom.
Yeah.
Then the second movement slows down. It's almost meditative, liturgical, spiritual, often sad. And then the third movement is the fastest, and that's the thrill ride that just, ends with a bang.
Yeah.
And we definitely see that here. The first play,
it's not exactly slow and subtle. Yeah, it is a grinding, ominous, doom-laden story from the beginning.
And there's so many methods of building up tension and irony, right? Like so the watchman sees the beacons. He's like, "Oh my God, this is amazing." And then the queen comes out, and we can see that she has all these reasons to hate her husband, but she's pretending to love him. Cassandra comes out. Obviously, she knows what's going to happen, but no one's going to believe her. The audience knows what's going to happen, but Agamemnon does not. Like, all these sources of tension are building up, building up, building up. Boom, he dies. And then we get, I think, as you brilliantly illustrated, the backstory, the explanation, why all this suffering, why all these terrible things, because this is an age of feuds. This is an age before the kind of democratic justice that Athens will champion many, many centuries later. This is a brutal age. And, classicists love the word subversive. This is a very subversive take on the age of heroes that's supposed to be a glorious age. But here we're seeing a dark side of that.
Yeah, that the age of heroes was also violent and lawless and unstable and had a lot of casualties at the civilian level, like the poor watchmen and the elders of the chorus. So, yeah.
So take us through movement 2 now. Now we slow down, we get dark, meditative. What happens?
Okay, so we've completed the longest play. Let's move on to the Libation Bearers, which is the second play. The Libation Bearers, at about 1,000 lines, is about 700 lines shorter than Agamemnon. And in the Libation Bearers, we meet Orestes, the kind of central character of the Orestian trilogy. Orestes is Agamemnon's son. The opening scene in the Libation Bearers is Orestes and his friend Pylades have come to visit the tomb of Agamemnon. Now, this is the exact same set as the previous plays was, except a tomb has been added, which is the place where Agamemnon was buried. So it's a very solemn beginning, probably quiet, mournful music that started the Libation Bearers after the intermission when this was premiered for the first time. Orestes and Pylades. Orestes expresses his sadness that he couldn't be there to help his father, and Orestes cuts off 2 locks of his hair, and he leaves them for his father. And then the 2 men hear some voices, some people are coming, and so they hide, and they just go off to stage right or something. And onto the stage walk Electra and the Libation Bearers, who are the chorus. So the Libation Bearers as a chorus are a little bit quieter and less assertive than the old men of Argos, who actively argue with Queen Clytemnestra in the previous play. The Libation Bearers, again, just a little bit more subdued.
And just to clarify, these are women servants who are attending their mistress and bringing offerings to the dead.
Thanks. Yeah, that's who they are and what they're doing. So Electra, after the first choral song by the Libation Bearers, Electra sees this lock of hair that Orestes has left there, and she sees that it's the same color and texture of her own, and she thinks maybe it's her brother's, and then she starts looking around and she sees footsteps that are the same shape as her own, and I guess maybe classical Athenians thought that brothers and sisters had the same feet, but works for me. But anyway, she realizes that Orestes must be around, and out Orestes comes, and so the brother and sister see one another for the first time in an unknown period, perhaps as long as 10 years. They do not have a pleasant catch-up session, Electra and Orestes. We might assume that they would say something like, "Oh, hey, it's been a while. Orestes, how are you?" "Oh, pretty good, Electra. And where have you been?" "Oh, I've been out on Crete, just playing some games and stuff." "Yeah, it's been pretty tough. Yeah, Dad died." But instead, they pretty much they pretty much immediately escalate to this really heightened level of violence. Let me see if I can find this page.
And while you're looking for that, her recognizing her brother's footsteps was a source of mockery and laughs in ancient times as well. But yeah, go on.
I didn't know that, Jack.
Yeah,
Thanks for that gem. Yeah, it's just a little bit odd, but still. Okay, so one of Electra's opening lines to her brother, reflecting on how both of them are angry at their mother Clytemnestra. I should have explained. The brother and the sister squarely blame Clytemnestra for Agamemnon's death. They don't think that the killing of Agamemnon for the murder of his daughter Iphigenia was justified. So the brother and sister, from the get-go, being apples that haven't fallen far from the tree, are out for revenge. So Electra says, thinking of her mother Clytemnestra, "O fierce, flint-hearted mother, to a flinty grave you bore him, a king by no procession, through mourning streets attended, a husband, laid unhonored, unwept in a cruel bed." And then Orestes and Electra have this whip-cracking back and forth where they kind of foment themselves into a greater and greater level of rage to take revenge on their mother for killing their father. So then the chorus tells Electra and Orestes about a nightmare that Queen Clytemnestra has had. In this nightmare, the queen has given birth to a snake, and the snake bit her breast so that a bunch of combined milk and blood came out. It's an awful dream. Orestes jumps on it and says, "That's me. I'm the breast-biting dream snake." So it's and then something else that's a little bit odd happens between the footsteps and the boob snake. The play has some giggleable material. The next kind of funny thing is that Orestes comes up with a plan because clearly revenge is his motivation. And he tells the chorus and his sister that his plan is that he and his thus far silent friend Pylades are going to fake Parnassan accents, and they're going to go right up to where the palace doors are nearby, and they're going to tell Queen Clytemnestra that they're seeking hospitality. So that's what happens in the play. It's a little bit funny that by faking accents, they think that their mother isn't going to recognize Orestes, but yeah, I think disguises in general work a lot better in literature than they do in real life. So anything to add so far, Jack?
Nothing really, just a minor point. It's interesting that they fake Parnassan accents because Mount Parnassus is where the Oracle of Delphi is, that is presided over by Apollo. So we're getting a bit of foreshadowing that at least Orestes is going to think of himself as an agent of Apollonian providence. But yet,
yeah, I never noticed that before. But of course, yeah, cool.
I never thought of it before until you mentioned it. But yeah.
So the plan is carried out using their new Parnassan accents. Orestes and his, again, utterly silent friend Pylades roll up to the palace steps, and they convince Clytemnestra that they're youths from the north, and she is sad to learn from Orestes that Orestes has died. Orestes tells her that Orestes has passed away, and then she lets them into the palace. And the libation bearers of the chorus sing another song. And then off screen, we hear the trademark scream of ancient Greek tragedy. And what happens is that the first murder in the second play, the Libation Bearers, is Orestes killing Aegisthus, his father's cousin. And the doors open, and Orestes kind of, just as unapologetically and vauntingly as Clytemnestra has killed Agamemnon, Orestes says, I've killed, this usurper, this man who tried to take my father's place. And now I'm going to kill my mother. And, a shudder sort of runs through the theater because a matricide is a crime that surprisingly hasn't happened yet in Orestes' long and gory lineage. And Orestes asks his friend Pylades, I think that I'm supposed to kill my mother. Apollo told me to kill my mother, but I hesitate to do so. And Pylades finally opens his mouth and he says, well, if Apollo told you that you have to kill Clytemnestra, then you have to kill Clytemnestra. And so Orestes gruesomely pins his mother down on the corpse of Aegisthus, and they have this back and forth exchange, which Jack and I are going to read for you. And I think the first line is yours. This is just before Orestes kills his mother.
Come on. I mean to kill you close beside him. While Aegisthus lived, you preferred him to my father. Sleep with him in death, for you love him and hate the man you should have loved.
I gave you your life. Let me then live out my own.
Live? Here in my house? You, my father's murderer?
My child, fate played a part. I was not all to blame.
Then here is another death decreed by the same fate.
My son, do you not fear a parent's curse?
You bore me, then discarded me to misery.
Sent you to trusted friends. Was that discarding you?
I was born free. You sold my body and my throne.
Sold? Where is any price I got for selling you?
Your price? I will not name him, for I blush for you.
Your father sinned too. Count his sins along with mine.
Silence! He spent himself in battle. You sat at home.
A woman without her man suffers no less, my son.
A man's work keeps and feeds the woman who sits at home.
Are you resolved, my son, to murder your own mother?
It will be your own hand that strikes you dead, not mine.
Beware the hounding furies of a mother's curse. So this ear-splitting curse that ends this exchange between them heralds what's going to come in the third play, although the Libation Bearers isn't over quite yet. The reason that I wanted to read this for you and that Jack humored me is that this is an example of what in classic scholarship is called stichomythia. It's a rapid back and forth whip-cracking exchange of lines, and it ultimately proved one of the most influential innovations of classical Athenian drama. We see it come up in Seneca a lot. Seneca, the Roman playwright who wrote during the 50s and 60s CE, he was very influential later during the Renaissance. So amazingly, this style of line, that relentless play-by-play ended up having a really long history later in literature.
And of course, in the original Greek, it had the pentameter meter that you might know from Shakespeare, the da-dun, 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 da-dun rhythm. So part of the joy that the audience experienced following these examples of stichomythia, which just means literally means line talking, okay? The reason this was so impressive to the audiences was that poetic, almost like a rap battle, you know?
Yeah, not losing a beat, so to speak.
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, really cool.
So, hold on, but then how does he actually kill her? Do we see it? Is it off stage? Tell us about that.
It's off stage. Then he forces her into the palace. The doors slam shut, and good grief, the next murder of the house of Atreus takes place in the Oresteia. So,
is that the end of the play?
No, not quite.
Okay.
There's one more earth-shattering moment, which we'll get to in just a second. So he shoves her into the palace, and tacitly, okay, well, gosh, he killed his mom. That's awful. And the chorus responds to this in kind of a complex way. It's interesting because these are slave women of Argos, and so they are probably not on board with yet another patriarch of the house of Atreus committing yet another familial murder, because these are old, experienced slave women. So their initial response is kind of revulsion and reluctance, but as their choral song zigs and zags, then they eventually kind of decide, well, this is what had to happen, and you know what, doggone it, Orestes did the right thing, he had to do it. The palace doors then open, and incredibly, if you saw this in 458 BCE, you would have seen the exact same blocking as you had at the end of the play Agamemnon. A murderer standing over two victims, only this time, instead of Clytemnestra standing over Agamemnon and Cassandra, you see Orestes standing over Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. And Orestes, as the family of Atreus tends to be, is unapologetic about this killing. He tells the chorus, what I'm going to do, because I realize this is an egregious crime, is that I'm going to go up to Delphi and seek refuge in the temple of Apollo at Delphi. And, wait a minute, then he stops talking because he sees something behind the chorus. And what he sees behind the chorus are the Furies. And the Furies are the most menacing, dark, scary, heavy metal monsters in ancient Greek mythology, in my opinion. And Orestes is immediately terrified. Just to be clear, the Furies were the agents of blood for blood revenge, and they must have caught wind of the murder of Clytemnestra, and they're therefore Orestes' blood. So the play ends with Orestes fleeing from the stage, the Furies pursuing him, and the chorus in a final line saying, quote, beware the hounding Furies of a mother's curse, close quote. And that's how number 2 of the Oresteia ended. After that, it would have been mid-afternoon if we were there, or late afternoon. We would have gotten some bread and olives and talked about what a, mind-bendingly amazing play it was. And then we would have come back to sit down for part 3.
Do we see the Furies at that point, or does he just speak? It's, oh my God, I see the Furies chasing me, and then he runs off.
It's a good question. Only Orestes can see them. I don't know if in the original staging the Furies, who are all over the third play, appeared in the second play. There was a story that the Furies, the costumes were so scary that Athenians in the original audience were terrified, and they were, having trouble staying in their seats. So
yeah, I think, we don't have the staging directions; they don't survive. But I think it makes sense that in the end of the second play, only Orestes sees them, and he speaks. He says, "Oh my God, I see these are like the phantoms or ghosts that are unleashed by an unjust death, much like in modern horror movies, right?" So I think it makes the most sense to think of him seeing them. The audience doesn't yet see them, but he describes it and runs off stage. We get that badass line you mentioned. And then they actually do appear in the third play, and that is the shocking thing, which later sources, as you said, said it was so shocking that women in the audience who were pregnant had miscarriages.
Oh, gosh.
Which, by the way, is one of the main arguments that women were indeed in the audience.
Oh,
Yeah. So,
yeah. I'll take any evidence I can get when it comes to information about ancient Greek theater attendees. So, yeah, sure. So, part 3?
yes, I just want to point out this beautiful, I mean, you already kind of mentioned it, but I want to highlight this beautiful symmetry between the endings of the two plays. And one of the key takeaways, I think, is that we're living in a world of vengeance and of feuds. And there are all these famous lines from the second play where one word is repeated, so that the implication is that this is a world where action causes reaction. So there's lines like blood leads to more blood, or this having been acted, I now must act. I don't remember all of them, but there are all these such lines that to just bring home this idea that there's a never-ending cycle of tit for tat, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth.
Yeah, and actually, thanks for underscoring that, because by the time this second main murder in the Oresteia has been committed, we feel like time is just this awful wheel that's going to keep grinding. The whole Trojan War was fought over a feud. Odysseus comes home after the Odyssey, and out of revenge, he kills all the suitors, and then the families of the suitors at the very end in Book 24 come after him, and this wheel seems to threaten to just keep spinning and spinning. And there's also one other kind of thing that comes up at the end of the Libation Bearers, which becomes a main subject in the Eumenides, which is there's different generations of gods that emblematize these different generations of violence. The old gods, the Furies, are the deities of this more primal period of vigilante killing. And then there is Apollo and Athena and Zeus, who represent a more enlightened era, we hope, although a lot of the stories about them are pretty scurrilous. But you ready to move on to the Eumenides?
Yes.
All right. So the Oresteia ends with a play called the Eumenides. The Eumenides has a different setting than the first two plays, which were both set at Argos. The Eumenides first begins at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, which is about 75 miles northwest of the city of Athens. Very gorgeous, picturesque setting. We're inside of the temple in this scene, and the Pythia, or the high priestess of Apollo, is going about her morning rounds and expressing her pieties to the god Apollo. And then she looks out the doors of her temple and she screams because she sees something. What she sees is Orestes, who has fled to the temple of Apollo at Delphi, as he said he would in the previous play, for solace, and he is surrounded by a pack of Furies. Only the Furies are sleeping. So the first thing that we hear out of the Pythia's mouth after her prayers to Apollo is this incredulous, horrified scream that these monsters have come to Delphi alongside Orestes. And Apollo then arrives at his own temple, and he tells Orestes that Orestes will be safe. Orestes will receive sanctuary with Apollo, although Orestes should go to Athens instead of Delphi, which is a bit of a strange thing because Apollo told Orestes to commit the murder, and then Orestes went to Apollo land to seek refuge, and Apollo says, you know what, Athena is probably a better candidate to handle this severity of crime and problems. So Orestes exits and goes down to Athens, and this leaves Apollo alone with the Furies. And then we have a pretty clear squaring off of the generations of gods, where the luminous god of reason, Apollo, argues with the Furies who represent vigilante justice and killing. They have a wonderful speech on in the Eumenides that I'll just open to real quick and read for you.
Well, before you do that, let me just insert a few things. So it was common practice in the ancient world, if you had committed a crime or if you were unjustly persecuted by a group of people, you could seek refuge in a temple, and as long as you were clutching the altar in your hands, nobody would dare to harm you, because that was thought of as like just something that's going to unleash the vengeance of the gods on you. So we can imagine Orestes is clinging to the altar, and the reason why the Furies are sleeping is because they know that as soon as he gets his hand off of that thing, he's fair game. So they're just slumbering, probably snoring. The description is wonderfully disgusting about like the goo oozing from their eyes, and they're just hideous looking. And also the fact here that Apollo sends him to Athens is interesting, because the chances that in the actual mythology that Aeschylus knew, that his audience knew, the chances that in the original mythology Orestes ever set foot in Athens is about 0%. Okay, this is a 100% Athenocentric fan fiction where Aeschylus is saying, you know what? Now I'm going to bring our hero to Athens, which would have never happened in the actual mythology, and I'm going to use this to share a vision, make a point, whatever, about my own city.
All excellent points, actually. Thanks for bringing all those up. Yeah. And so Orestes goes off to Athens in order to satisfy, Aeschylus's motivations to make Athens the center of the story, which he does a nice job of. The Furies argue with Apollo, and they kind of present their case to Apollo. We should have at least a couple of lines from the Furies' voice, because their songs are some of the most just wild and fearsome. I would have loved to hear the music that went behind what we can think of as lyrics that I'm going to read to you here. So the Furies to Apollo say, quote, "The fault's not ours. It lies with younger gods who rise in place of those who ruled before. From stool to crown their throne is stained with gore. See how earth's central sacred stone has taken for its own a grim pollution justice must abhor." They're talking about the omphalos, this navel stone that was at the center of the temple of Apollo at Delphi. They say to Apollo, quote, "Phoebus, for all your prophet's skill, your holy wisdom by this deed, you of your own unprompted will have sullied your own altar's flames, infringing laws by gods decreed, and destiny's primeval claims, to grant some mortals passing need." So they feel like Apollo has broken all of the ancient rules that once governed the two generations of gods just for some random guy, and this is the source of their rage. So the scene of the Eumenides then shifts to Athens. You going to say something?
I could. So just
Yeah,
the divine realm I think is meant to parallel the human realm, and just as
absolutely.
Aeschylus wants to show a transition from an earlier brutal Bronze Age vengeance-obsessed society to a democratic, just new world, new civilization, so too the Furies represent one of the primeval gods. They are called chthonic, like CHTH, chthonic deities. They're like born from the earth. They're part of like the original spiritual stuff that came out of the earth before the rational Olympians came later and superimposed a more enlightened rational order. And so the Athenians actually still worshipped the earlier gods. They still had shrines in Athens to the Furies. Oh, we forgot to mention that the name of the play is the Eumenides, which is a euphemism. It's like the well thinkers, like the spirits that think well, in a sense.
Right. They get a name change at the end of the play.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is a common practice in early societies to rename something terrifying with a nice sounding name. So the Athenians never tried to completely forget the Furies. They realized they could never do that. But here they're seeking a balance between the rational Apollo and the substrate of emotions and psychological powers that we'll never get rid of in our human souls.
Well said, dude. Yeah. I think when we come to Greek mythology and ancient Greek literature for the first time, we kind of wish everything would just hold still and there would be a stable org chart where this or that deity just stood for this or that one thing. But really, it's often very different from century to century, place to place, decade to decade. And so the Oresteia is a good place to start because it's such a colossal snapshot of how the most famous classical city thought of some of these gods and monsters. So, okay, so the Furies and Orestes, and they all come to Athens in order to decide what's going to happen to Orestes. The Furies sing another dark song about how they're going to have Orestes' blood. This is a moment in the Oresteia where it's just blood, blood, blood. It just keeps coming back again and again and again. And then the central situation of the Oresteia squares off. The central situation of the Oresteia is essentially a trial. And what we have in the trial is, at the top is Athena. she is the judge. Athena appoints some Athenians to be the jurors. The prosecution are the Furies. The plaintiff is Clytemnestra. The defendant is Orestes, and the defense is Apollo. So there's this scene that lasts for about half of the play where we find out how this trial proceeds, and it's all overseen by Athena, and it's very interesting how they come to the verdict. But what happens, I guess, to give a play-by-play that's pretty quick, is that Orestes immediately admits guilt. He says, well, yes, I did stab my mother through the heart. And the Furies say, okay, we have an admission of guilt. Let us drink this guy's blood and wear him as a hat, because the Furies just want to run around with hand grenades and chainsaws and wreak havoc. And so they're ready to take Orestes out at this point. And then Apollo begins Orestes' defense. And Apollo's case is, he has a couple of different points that he makes in his case, and none of them are very up to point with modern standards. What has been aired before the court so far has been that Orestes has clearly admitted to killing his mother. And in addition, I forgot to say this, but the Furies have emphasized that killing a spouse, like Clytemnestra killed Agamemnon, is nothing in comparison to killing somebody who is genetically related to you, because Orestes had killed his mother. So his crime was much severer. This is what Apollo has to answer to. Apollo emphasizes essentially that the killing of a woman is less important than the killing of a man, and that the killing of a mother is a thing of little consequence. Because in a very famous moment of the Oresteia, he essentially implies that motherhood doesn't exist. So I'm going to read this to you, if that's okay with Jack, this really famous moment of the Eumenides that a lot of classic scholars have had fun with over the years because it's just so wonky. I can also just summarize it. Okay.
Why don't you just summarize it then?
I'll summarize it.
Let's hear the Doug version for once.
Yeah. So what Apollo tells the court is that he stands up in front of them and he says, women are not mothers because women just hold the seeds of men. Women just carry these seeds from men like a garden that is allowing a seed to germinate and grow into a plant. That's the argument, that man is the sole source of life. In one translation, man, the one who mounts, is the sole source of life. Women just nurture it into being. And so, I mean, it's a heinously stupid argument by modern genetic standards, and we shouldn't really think probably that ancient Greeks believed everything that we see in ancient Greek plays. Maybe some people in the audience scratched their beards and said, oh yeah, that's true, but there were probably others who said, what? But the important thing is that this argument impresses Athena, because at the end of this speech that Apollo makes, Apollo says, look, case in point, Athena was not nurtured by a mother's womb. Athena was born from the head of her father Zeus, which she was in Greek mythology. So Athena hears this story, and she doesn't immediately come to a verdict, but the jury does its work. The jury ends up with a tied vote, and Athena weighs in as the tiebreaker. And Athena says, well, based on everything that I've heard, this thing about men really being the sources of life, and also something else that Apollo had said. Apollo said that he had been compelled by Zeus to tell Orestes to kill Clytemnestra. And Athena says, I can't break the word of my father Zeus, and this argument that Apollo made makes sense to me, and so I'm going to cast my vote with Orestes. So, the trial is over. Not everybody is happy, especially the Furies, because then you think, okay, well, that's interesting. I wonder what's going to happen now, because at other moments in ancient Greek literature, like Statius's Thebaid, when the Furies get off their leash, they can really cause a lot of carnage. So Athena deals with them. And this is kind of getting back to something that Jack said earlier about parallels to contemporary Athenian history. But what Athena tells the Furies is that the Furies will stay in Athens, and they will be transformed into the Eumenides, or the kindly ones, and they will always be a part of Athenian history and that she respects them just as they respect her. And she gives an absolutely rhetorically wonderful speech to the, at this point, very pissed off Furies. And she slowly wins them over. And the ending choral songs are songs of radiant joy. And I always think this must have been one of the most happy endings in all of literary history, because in a way, it's a song that's about the ORESTEIA and this old family, their violence coming to an end. But it's also a song about Athens itself, for reasons that we can get into in a minute, and the Athenian modernity emerging from a much bumpier and more difficult past. And it's just nice to imagine ancient Athenians attending this in the spring of 458 BCE as the sun went down, just looking at each other as those choral songs ended and feeling this sense of civic solidarity, and that, like, wow, we've been through a lot. We've been through the Persian Wars together, and we've been through some bumps in early democracy, but here we are. So that's the end of the plot of the Eumenides.
Okay, wow. Again, okay, I have a lot of thoughts about this.
Let's bring this into more of a discussion now, and I'll stop talking for huge blocks.
I'm gonna just offer, in no particular order, some thoughts on this, and please interrupt me if you want to chime in. So, I do know from my studies of ancient philosophy that there were a lot of debates at this time between, proto-scientists and philosophers about how much, as we would say, genetic material a father and mother contribute to the offspring, and there were some who argued that they both contribute equally. There were others, like Aristotle famously, and like Apollo in this case, who argued that the father contributes more. So this was an ongoing debate. I think Apollo's argument is weak here, and it's interesting that the Athenian jurors who are taking part in this trial, they are split 50-50, right? Like, they are not convinced by Apollo's weak argument, right?
Yeah.
They're not convinced. It's Athena who, almost out of a sense of duty or something, or some kind of civilizational vision, casts the vote in favor of Orestes.
And she is bowing to, at least Apollo essentially says, hey, you know what? Zeus told me to do it. That's one of his main lines of defense, in addition to that more iffy line about motherhood and how it works. And so, it's not the most, like, morally satisfying thing, because Zeus isn't a character in this play, and who knows, people have done all kinds of things because they've said that gods told them to do it. But yeah, this is Apollo's line of reasoning. Yeah.
There's another crucial background bit of information we need to talk about, which is the Areopagus and Ephialtes reforms.
Let's do it. Do you want to do it or me?
Take it away.
Okay. So in the late 460s, the famous Athenian reformer Ephialtes made some serious steps forward for Athenian democracy. One of the things that a lot of us assume when we start learning about the democracy of ancient Athens is that, around 508 BC, they just flipped on a switch and it was democratic. It doesn't work that way, because there are entrenched powers that are still trying to safeguard the vestiges of their interests and safeguard their financial interests. And so Ephialtes, after a lot of earlier lumps and bumps in Athenian democracy, made some very consequential reforms in the late 360s, so right before the Oresteia. And these reforms made it such that people could hold public office with much less property. So in other words, like, more commoners could get into, probably not commoners, not peasants, but more ordinary Athenian citizen males could get into public offices. He instituted a system of checks and balances such that people were monitored by state agencies. And he took a lot of the power away from this old boys club called the Areopagus that used to hold a lot of sway in the early part of the Athenian democratic society, and really paved the way for a much more democratic period of Athenian democracy. You should probably add to that, Jack.
Well, it's the last point that I want to focus on. So, in earlier times, the Areopagus, as you called it, it was like the country club of the elite of Athens. Everybody who actually made decisions was part of that elite group. And it was a council that had extraordinary powers in deciding the affairs of state. During the Persian invasion, it was the Areopagus that promised the citizens a lot of money if they would get in those ships and row, risk their lives and row against the Persian navy. Kind of like the GI Bill in World War II, where the government promised all these benefits if people would fight, and then they had to deliver, and you get basically this new middle class that emerges. So 20 years later, when these middle classes had children, and those children are asking for more, Ephialtes comes around and says, you know what? We're going to switch things up a little bit. We're going to strip away the power from the Areopagus court, and we're going to limit it to only one function. They're going to be the homicide court of Athens. All the other powers will be taken away, given to more popular courts, more popular assemblies. But the one thing they will still keep is they are the jurors for murder trials. Now, the Areopagites, the members of this elite club, were extremely furious about this. Ephialtes was assassinated. It's the only assassination that happens in the first half century of Athenian democracy, and it shows you how volatile this period was. How it was so volatile, it was risking going back to a kind of feud, a kind of blood begets blood system.
Yeah.
So here, this is the genius of this play, for me at least. Aeschylus he sees all these tensions. He sees the blood that was just shed. He wants to synthesize this into something that the Athenians can move forward with. And so he effectively invents a new foundation myth for Athenian democracy and the Areopagus, because again, none of this was in the original mythology. Just as there is no way that Orestes in the actual mythology ever went to Athens, as we mentioned earlier, there's also no way that the Areopagus even existed way back then as an institution, let alone as a homicide court, which was a brand new role it had just acquired at the time of Aeschylus writing this play. So with this new foundation myth, this new noble lie, as Plato might have called it, Aeschylus is taking this new constraint on the elites of Athens and is giving it mythological significance. It's like he's telling the elites, don't be upset about this new restricted function of your club. Instead, this new role that you have can be thought of as the foundation of our civilization. Athena herself gave her blessing, and whatever anger you have, you elites, about being forced to deal with a more democratic system, you can suppress those furies. They can still remain in Athens. And we're never going to, she says, you're never going to have a city without tension. But what you need is a balance. You need a balance between the tensions and the cooperation. And that's the vision forward. And that is going to be the new vision of Athens. And this is why this trilogy is like a manifesto.
Yeah. It's written by somebody who understands democracy so well, warts and all, problems and all, internal tensions and all. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that's my take on why this is brilliant. How about you, looking back now at the three plays you just laid out for us, what do you see as the,
I couldn't have summarized the historical importance of the whole thing better than you just did, but I would just make one more addition, which I suspect you'd agree with, that when Agamemnon dies at the end of the play, Agamemnon, there are some parallels that historians have drawn and classicists have drawn between Agamemnon and the dead Persian king Xerxes. And in a way, it's symbolic of, we don't put up with despots here who come and try to rule over us.
Tell us more about this contrast that you see implied here.
There's not much to it, really. I think Agamemnon is he's a despot during the Trojan War. He expects to come home and continue stomping around Argos and ruling as usual, even though he's killed his daughter. He expects to be an autocrat who gets away with anything. And I think, in a way, Aeschylus, who had fought at the Battle of Marathon and the Battle of Salamis, in the play Agamemnon, he draws some parallels between Agamemnon and Xerxes, and the emphasis is simply that Athens is no place for autocrats, be they Persian warlords or ancient legendary Greek kings.
Any last words on the Oresteia as a theatrical trilogy?
Yeah, I think, we've just gone through all three of these plays, and that's a little bit unusual because it's a long story with a lot of prehistory to it. But what we just did was actually what ancient Athenians did in the 5th century BCE when they went to the theater. It's a long haul. They went to watch plays all day together. It was a day of music, and it was a day of conversation, surely, in between the plays. It was a day of seeing some of the intelligentsia of the city, and it was a day of civic solidarity. And then in the evening, it was probably an evening of some wine and laughter, because after these three grave, serious plays, there came a sad play at which you would, laugh your tail off and then go off and enjoy the rest of your evening as the holiday continued. So reading these as a set, there is something to that, to really enjoy what the city Dionysia festival must have felt like in antiquity.
Amazing. Well, Doug, thank you for your dramatic acumen and flair, and thanks for bringing this to life with us.
It's my pleasure, and thanks for jumping in and helping me out, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks again.